AI is changing how we work, how we build, how we lead, and honestly, how we think about what we're even here to do. The question I get asked most isn't actually a question, it's a feeling. Something between, am I going to be okay? And what am I anymore? I hear it in every conversation I have, and it always leads back to the same place. If AI can do everything we do, what's left?
What's left when the dust clears? What's left past the loud cheers? What's left? We're pulling at the threads to see what's left under every hot take, every belief. Leaning, we're cutting through the noise, the mess. What's next starts right here on What's Left. Hey!
I think the time has finally come when we can say Agile is dead.
Distribution of your product is even more important because your product features are no longer defensible.
Welcome everybody to our first episode of What's Left, where we dig into how to survive and thrive in the age of AI. Today, we're joined by Cole Murray, who is a technologist who's had an incredible career. He has been working with big data before big data was even cool. One of his big roles at Amazon was on the similarities team, where he was able to build out features like customers who also bought, you should also recommend that. And then today, he helps Series A and seed startups really figure out how to productionize AI, how to harden large language model security, and how to be able to up-level engineering workflows. Cole Murray, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to today's chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. I want to start off with asking you a general question. I read Hacker News a lot. Every time there is any instance of an open source project that's been vibe coded by Claude, I see two camps. One camp is very negative, and one camp is very positive. What is your take on the state of engineering today, and would you fall into a camp? If you do, and you may not.
Yeah, I think with vibe-coded projects, they can be very successful for getting from that 0 to 1 phase, allowing you to prove out the idea, the concept of whatever you're trying to demonstrate. Now, I think building a vibe-coded project is very different than building a company. I find that the people who are building these learn that sooner or later. But yes, I think it's a very positive aspect of the ecosystem. I think it's good that we are able to experiment very rapidly. I do find in some cases there is quality issues with those projects, but overall I think it's a positive benefit to the ecosystem.
And when you say positive, do you mean in the sense that what a lot of people talk about is there's a lot more accessibility to be able to build, or developers are able to prototype faster? Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you are thinking is the positive here?
I think that there's a couple different positive aspects to it. The first is removing the cost to experimentation. And so we can very quickly take a fringe idea that we were sitting at lunch and, hey, what if we could build this? Well, in about 10 minutes now we can, and we can have something that is viable and working that allows us to then get consensus around whether it's actually a good idea and worth pursuing further. I think the other interesting trend with vibe coding projects is this idea of personalized software. The idea that I can now build a piece of software purely for myself or my friends or family, whoever needs it. And we're seeing a lot of that where people are building apps for their kids. They're building custom wrappers around YouTube to control what is being shown.
Yep.
And I think the last interesting piece that is positive is that software that was not previously accessible primarily due to budget is now possible. The mom and pop shop down the street who was previously building a website with Wix, a Shopify or something like that, now can actually have a more fully fledged product without the cost associated that traditionally came with that.
All three resonate very deeply with me. On the first one, I have a bit of a hot take here. It's been said many times before, but I think the time has finally come when we can say Agile is dead. And what I mean by that is I think the process of figuring out requirements, writing PRDs, doing design prototypes, and then doing some initial code has now been so condensed down so that anyone, whether you're a product manager, marketing, even accounting, you can now build in that cycle faster than ever before.
I partially agree with the take. I strongly agree with the compression of the time. I think in a previous world where a team would iterate on an idea for 2-3 weeks at a time, and then we go through this approval phase, that is primarily gone. The product manager can now come, whether it's a lovable prototype, something they built in Cursor, they can then present to the engineering team and have their idea 80% of the way. And so I think that the big issue now that we're running into is what to actually build. Yes, we can rapidly build things, but we still do need the agile planning aspect where we are directionally focused on what to build rather than building all the things just because we can.
In order to make a decision on what to build next, we would go through a lot of roadmap planning and figuring out. It was always having a hypothesis of what we can build, and getting to the point where we can actually get it to users was painful. And it's only after we get it to users when we actually understand product market fit. Now, that painful process of getting to users is easier than ever before, but it is fraught with peril. So when you say it's more important than ever before to understand what to build next, can you just elaborate on that?
I think it depends a lot on where you are in your company's life cycle. If you are pre-product market fit, then very much you should try many ideas simultaneously. As your company matures, your experimentation space becomes confined by time availability. And so, yes, you can build 20 variants of some product idea and all of these features, but we're only able to experiment with those on the customer with so many at any given time. And so that's where that decision framework becomes very critical. And if there is 2 variants of that feature competing, yes, you can build it in 20 minutes, but we are still constrained by that long pole of actual customer metrics coming back.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's probably the best bottleneck to have, is truly understanding your customer and giving them the time to digest and use it versus, hey, let's push 50 new features on them because we thought they would be cool. So I love the thinking there. And with this kind of culture of just ship it, right? You mentioned that if you're a pre-market fit, what advice would you give to a pre-market fit company who's just throwing everything at the wall today?
Yeah, I think now that the barrier to building has been effectively minimized, the distribution of your product is so much more important. It was always important, and that was a big lesson that I learned from my first startup. But I think now, given that anyone can clone any successful feature in a very short amount of time, the distribution of your product is even more important because your product features are no longer defensible. And we're starting to see that with a lot of the big players in the space, where they see a startup who has a successful business model, and as it starts to become demand, they add that feature as well.
I've seen a lot of acquisitions happen in the last couple of months. OpenAI brought on the engineer who built OpenClaw. Facebook just got the engineers who built Moltbook. What do you think the strategy is behind those types of acquisitions?
I think maybe not so much in the case of Moltbook.
I had to throw that one out there.
But in the case of OpenClaw, as of today, saw the team that builds UV, which is a developer tool for Python. They were just recently acquired. I think it fits into a bigger picture of owning the developer ecosystem. The model providers are obviously owning the model itself. And as they expand and start acquiring the tools actually being used in the ecosystem, they, to a sense, get some control over the direction of those tools and can fit that into their long-term roadmap of, at least as I see it, eventually owning the entire developer ecosystem. And so you could think about GitHub right now plays a very big role within the developer ecosystem. We're starting to see that being eroded away by the teams. We have Cursor now has released Cursor Agents, which and automations, which is fairly close to GitHub Actions. It's not exactly the same. There's rumors that OpenAI is building their own version of GitHub. We see Anthropic at least looking like they're going to start competing against a Lovable type competitor where they could also own basically the entire infrastructure stack and not only just the HTML artifact that gets produced. And so I think that, yes, the OpenAIs, the Anthropics, they are making plays to consume the larger ecosystem such that they can basically control your entire developer experience.
Today, what is your preferred tech stack?
It's a mix. For local development, I think Claude Code is the go-to. I prefer that over Codex. Now, a big trend that we're starting to see recently is this move away from localhost to running your agent sessions within the cloud.
Yep.
And so for that, I use a framework that I had released. It's called OpenInspect. It was built on Ramp's blog post, outlining kind of their internal background agent system.
Can you explain a little bit about their background agent system and like why they built it?
The idea of background agents is to solve a few different problems that we're starting to see. The first issue is that localhost development, once you get into a environment where you're running multiple sessions simultaneously, begins to start to have friction. Now, the today go-to solution to that is using a technology called Git worktrees. Yep. The idea of that is that we are, in a sense, going to clone multiple copies of a GitHub repo, and we can operate on them without conflicting. Where this starts to break down is that as the session count is growing on your machine, the underlying resources of your machine are not. And so each of those sessions is now running linters, it's running tests. If you're running a language that compiles, it's compiling. It's running the dev server in every single one of these work trees, and it's eventually consuming all of your system's resources. And so as the models are progressing, moving from the previous model where developers were very much steering the model. They were, oh no, don't go down this path, do this, don't do that. I think that we're starting to see that world going away, and the models are now becoming very capable in taking a specification and turning that into completed pull requests. And so in that world where the model is effectively doing all of the coding, we are going to have many sessions running in parallel. And the joke that I make is that unless your plan is to have a supercomputer sitting next to you under the desk with all of the fans roaring, we have to figure out a different way to solve this problem. And historically, how we've solved that is by pushing this to the cloud. And so at a whole, that's the conceptualization of a background agent, just the idea that we are going to move the agent session into the cloud. The first was what I mentioned, that localhost doesn't really scale. The other is that in a large company environment, you typically have a very complex developer environment, and it requires a lot of setup to do that. And so that same localhost problem, you can now imagine compounded across 20 different microservices that somehow need to be run on my local machine. What they did is basically take that entire environment and put it into the sandbox. And so each agent that spawns up has a perfectly pristine copy of that environment that is the exact environment every single time. And that's huge for the repeatability of it. The other issue that they highlighted that I agree with as well is that we're starting to see a shift away from the engineer being the only one who's contributing code. In that previous world of localhost, it was fine that the engineer had to toil with setting up the environment because they could figure it out. I think that expectation of having a PM set up that environment is not practical, and the sandbox environment solves that because the PM is no longer configuring the environment. It's perfectly reproduced every time.
I'm going to give you another hot take.
Sure.
I've been doing AI consulting for the past 2 years, helping businesses adopt AI, and I've tried to simplify it down into 2 metrics, and the second metric is my hot take. The first metric is 95% of your employees are using an AI chat hub like Claude once a week. That's phase 1 to me, in being able to drive the AI fluency of the entire employee base. Now, what I think true adoption and phase 2, 95% of your employees can contribute code. And that is damn near impossible right now.
Sure.
But I think that's where we want to take it to. I'm a big believer that anyone can be a builder. And the more we reduce the friction to building and just let people express themselves, express their taste and their features and their own requirements without the full like development cycle, and we compress that down to them iterating in real time, I think there's something really powerful in that and empowering for employees. I'm wondering, what's your take on my hot take?
I agree with your hot take. I don't know about the 95% number, but I do think that we will continue to see contributions outside of just engineering. I think the old world where a PM is filing a bug ticket and pinging engineers, please help me.
Yep.
I think that world is a legacy world. We're starting to see that, and I'm seeing this within my own consultancy, where PMs and customer support are now able to not only root cause the change that caused the regression, but also then have the agent contribute the fix.
Right.
Now, engineering is still signing off on this loop, but the barrier of getting those changes up is no longer purely an engineering function.
We've talked a little bit about more established corporations and businesses versus some smaller ones. Is there a fundamental difference in how the teams are operating today, whether it's large or small, or are they all kind of converging on best practices of how to work with AI engineers?
I see these smaller teams embracing it much more. I think the smaller teams have realized that it's pretty clear there's a lot of leverage by using AI. Whereas I find in the larger companies, there typically is a lot less pressure to use AI. And for whatever reason, I think maybe it's just the self-selecting nature of working at a smaller company or a larger company. There's a lot less experimentation going on in the rapidly changing AI space.
And to hone in on a little bit of the startups and the smaller ones, given you've done a couple of startups, if you were to do another startup today, thinking about what you've learned from before, is there anything that you would change in your approach?
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson that I learned from my last startup was not the idea of product market fit, but the idea of founder market fit. And what I mean by that is that most of the industry is built around this idea of, oh, you have a product and the market needs it and there's this demand. Kind of going back to my previous point, a really big problem with that idea is how are you going to get distribution for your product, especially in a world where the expert in that space can now spend their weekends building their own product. And so the idea then of founder market fit is that you want to be building a product that you as a founder are the correct fit for. You have the relationships that are needed to open up the doors. As an example, myself would not be a great fit to open a medical practice AI startup because I don't have the connections to open those doors. Whereas someone whose father is a doctor or they themselves used to be a doctor, they have some type of connections that are going to bridge that distribution gap, I think is extremely important in today's world.
So to repeat back a little bit of what I'm hearing in your perspective here, it's what you can build is no longer a moat as it once was. And now it's really your understanding of the industry and your relationships in that industry that are in the distribution that is actually where the moat is starting to lie in.
Yes, very much. Because now that domain expert, they can go and copy the idea. You build this amazing product, you're pre-market fit, you're getting customers. They will go and raise $30 million. They have all of the connections to open the door. And very much now you are in an uphill battle where they are on top of the hill.
So in building off this concept of a subject matter expert starting to build on their own, in my experience, I personally know two CEOs. One is in more kind of hardware and HVAC, another is in warehousing. And these CEOs would be typically in those industries, you'd think they'd be the last ones to vibe code. One of the CEOs I personally taught how to vibe code, and going through all the problems that you mentioned about local hosting, that's just an experience difficulty for someone getting into the space. We had to build out a pipeline where you can go from Claude Code to Git to Vercel and use those Git work trees, and everything is done in the cloud. From an experience model that's the lens that made it way easier for the CEO to start. And the reason why I bring this up is because he sees all of the little nuanced friction points in his business that he's now able to address himself. Do you think going forward, more and more people are going to be able to build their own like this?
Yes, very much. To touch on the Claude Code, very much I'm seeing that across other people as well, where it almost has an addictive nature to it, where you are able to solve your problem. And previously developing that had a lot of friction, be fairly mentally fatiguing. A lot of that is pretty smoothed over now, where you're able to go from, I have this problem, I type in a problem, obviously with enough expertise, and I get the result that I want. And so you're getting the reward without necessarily having to do the mentally fatiguing work. And that loop is pretty addicting in that you're able to see your success and very rapidly with fairly little cost, both monetarily and like mental exhaustion. Specific to the CEO, I think, yes, very much we're going to continue to see that trend. I think where that trend breaks down a little bit is more in very technical businesses.
Yes.
And as an example, if using the HVAC as an example, I don't think he would go in Claude Code with a 3D printer hooked into Claude Code and start redesigning HVAC components. Now, could he do that? He probably could.
If I told him he could do that and there's a pipeline or an MCP for 3D modeling.
There is.
Yes.
But I guess my point is that I think as things become more technical and more difficult to validate, that trend starts to break down a bit.
Do you have any further insights about how AI helps businesses grow healthy and your role in that as a leader?
So with helping businesses become healthy, I think we need to look at the larger product development of the company itself, as well as just the company as a whole. And so myself as a leader in that space, I typically start that transformation with engineering. And that starts out with assessing where is the company currently at in their AI journey. They can be on the very left side, what I call level 1, which is they are basically using some form of AI code assistance, whether that's Copilot or Cursor Tab, but it's very much still the developer in the loop and guiding the process directly. Level 2, I start to see is where teams are using the agent itself, typically in Cursor, and pushing a lot more of those changes to the agent itself. And it is building out kind of their idea. They're still fairly involved in that process, but they themselves have moved away from directly writing the code. I find that is a pretty critical point to get the teams to, and it requires a lot of effort to get there. And so the next kind of bucket is that teams who are using AI, they're typically at that level 2 with Cursor, and they are allowing the agent to make the changes, but they quickly realize that they're not getting the efficiency that they're hearing about. And a lot of that is driven because they are only running one Cursor agent at a time. And so if you've used a Cursor agent previously, it will run for 5 to 10 minutes at a time. And during those 5 to 10 minutes, most of the time the engineers are just sitting there and waiting for this to finish. And so the different types of groups have different ways that you address those problems. With the skeptics, I find a very good way to address that is twofold. One, you need the management of the company backing this completely, that, hey, we support AI, this is going to be a thing, and we need to get everyone on board. Once we've addressed that hurdle, then it's how do we get them back into that driver's seat to try this experience again? I think what I see and typically guide my clients through is doing some form of a hackathon within the company. And it could be anything. It could be a set theme where we're going to build an internal tool. It could be build your own tool. I'll typically then sit in as a judge on those hackathons just to give it some structure. And I find that those are a lot of fun and will typically sway the skeptics out once they're using modern tooling. The next group of the people who are using it and they're starting to embrace it, I find that those are a lot more eager to learn. And in those cases, it's really just setting a curriculum of how do we get you from where you are to kind of state-of-the-art development. Kind of zooming out a bit into the bigger picture, we've focused primarily on engineering there. Once engineering is at state-of-the-art, it quickly starts creating problems within the rest of the organization because engineering is moving so fast. The PMs who have maybe not been fully embracing AI were used to a cycle where they could create a PRD and have a gap of 2 weeks or so before engineering is starting to move on it. That PRD is now getting completed in 1 to 2 days. And so that then is typically where the next part of my engagement will go of, okay, we need to upskill the PMs within the organization. In those cases, it really depends on where they are in terms of tooling. I find a lot of them are using ChatGPT or Claude on the web. I think either of those can be great starting points, but they typically run into a lot of friction because they're not directly integrated into the rest of the company. They don't have access to the knowledge base. They don't have access to the support queue or the issues within the stack. And so the kind of efficiencies that is the same problem there, where they're not integrating AI into the actual company. They're using it as a tool, but it's not connected to the larger company. And so same kind of idea there of we need to bring them into an environment, whether that's Cursor, whether that's Claude Code, Claude Cowork, I think is great. It really depends on what tooling the company wants to use. And getting it such that they are not only using AI, but that AI is connected to all of the other systems within the company. After that point, typically the engagements will go to sales and marketing. Again, same idea there where, hey, we're running ad copy and we send this off to this person and it comes back in a week or 2 weeks. We're not doing that anymore. We're doing this in 1 or 2 days now.
One is, as a former PM, I have loved having access to the repo.
Sure.
And I think anyone who's a PM needs to understand how to use Claude Code or Cursor to unearth how to properly make a PRD. I think PRDs now are actually just the planning document for what an agent should be doing. That is how I've seen it evolve. And when you have access to the repo, my typical approach nowadays is tell me how everything is working. And that was always such a difficult part as a PM, especially in a larger organization. I don't know how everything works right now.
Sure.
But now you could, all of that information you could source on your fingertips, which is, I think, PMs definitely need to let go of PRDs and get in the code, understand how the product truly works. Now, the second part here, I have a follow-up question. When you go through this process and you say development is state of the art, we have PMs on board, we have marketing on board, what quantifiable and qualitative benefits to the business have you seen come out of this? And it can be tangible or non-tangible in your experience.
Yeah, I think the most obvious one is the accelerated product development. And typically I'll guide teams through that where we say, okay, what is your quarterly roadmap? Ideally they have one. And say, okay, you have an entire quarter to do this. Let's target half the time or whatever time frame they feel comfortable with. And that within itself, I think, is pretty quantifiable where we can look and say that this used to take 4 months. We did it in 2 months. A common ask that I get that I typically have a lot of initial friction with, I find a lot of teams initially very much care about whether it's lines of code, story points, or some type of metric to quantify the engineering.
Yep.
I find that that is, in general, a very bad way of trying to gauge the success of your engineering team. And it can be easily gamed. If someone's performance is directly tied to how many issues they're closing, they're probably going to create more issues because that is just the incentives that you have given them. And so I think the way that I typically bridge that is, again, rather than focusing on the engineering metrics here of lines of code, other things, let's focus on the business metrics that we're trying to actually achieve. If it's a revenue product-based team, then we can look at whether it's monthly active users, whether it's directly dollars per user. Let's move away from these arbitrary metrics of performance to actually caring about the performance of the business.
I love that. That's super powerful. That perspective of focusing on business objectives and being able to tie not only engineering initiatives better, but also AI initiatives is really powerful. There's I would say a lot of overlap where I would say you are that fractional CTO, AI consultant, fractional AI leader for more product-led companies. And I've been focusing more on service-based companies. And it's been very similar in the sense that you do have to go a little bit department by department, and everybody needs to get their own little aha moment. And once you have at least one, you can have it start to spread a little bit. And people can be like, what did you do there? What was that prompt? I love seeing someone's face light up the first time they use like Claude Cowork, and they're like, whoa, I just gave it like 6 PDFs and output in Excel in the standardized format with everything correct.
Yes.
Right? It's like, so to kind of wrap things up here, I think outside of business, outside of the AI industry, the normal person still doesn't know a lot about AI. And when you don't understand something, that leads to fear, hesitation. And I think the core question that I see coming up time and time again is, if AI can do everything that I can do, what's left? So I want to ask you, from an engineering point of view, what's left?
I think, yes, AI is very capable at coding. It does a pretty good job at architecture and other parts of the stack, and I think that will continue to improve. I think what AI is not going to be good at, and where things are currently at, is judgment. The AI is not able to discern whether option A or B is a better fit for your business. It will recommend you this architecture for this system. Now, is that a good architecture? If you don't have the engineering expertise, you don't have a say in whether it's a good architecture. Looking at that outside of engineering, it's the same advice that I give to design. I find a lot of designers are very worried what their career prospects look like. I think it's the same story there. An engineer is not going to have the vocabulary and the understanding of design to even be able to correctly prompt the AI to get those results. The same with the PM. I think any expert within their domain, they have that domain expertise that the AI, it just doesn't. Mm-hmm. Yes, it can produce good quality results, but if you don't have the domain knowledge to put into the prompt, then you're subject to whatever results you get out, and you don't know how to control them because you are not the expert.
In the vein of kind of open source development, and a whole lot of projects are being built in open source. Some people I've seen frustration that it's been kind of vibe coded, right? Like OpenClaw was vibe coded. But then at the same time, there's a lot of interesting projects like yours, OpenInspect, that you've built. And like you mentioned earlier, it's been built off what RAMP has developed in-house, and you wanted to make that available. Can you explain a little bit more about your motivations of going open source?
There was a few motivations behind it. The first, I think that the background agents infrastructure is going to be a critical piece of infrastructure for companies. We have now seen Ramp post a post about this, Stripe posted about it, Coinbase posted about it. I think the list is going to continue to go on. And so given that this is such a critical piece of infrastructure and in some way needs to be integrated into your larger company ecosystem, I find that a lot of the existing solutions have a lot of friction because of that, where it's actually pretty difficult to support every company's unique kind of infrastructure environment. And because of that, I think that a open source solution where you can fork it, you can customize, is kind of the winning answer here. The second motivation behind it was primarily just, I'm seeing a lot of what I would describe as like bad practice within the industry, where everyone is trying to max extract money from everyone. And again, given that this is your critical infrastructure, I just didn't really like that. And so I just released it so that anyone can customize it. And I thought that there was just a need for this within the ecosystem where somebody needs to have the open source solution, and I didn't really see anything for it. And so I released it.
who would you say is, or when would you say is the appropriate time to consider OpenInspect for your infrastructure?
As soon as possible.
You helped advise myself on our project, YourPath.care. And we've been essentially vibe coding ever since, after you gave us your blessing. The context here is I went to Cole and I asked him, do we need to find a CTO? Do we need to find someone who's technical enough for our project? And I really valued your advice, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but the main thing I took away was that what we are building for YourPath.care is so not reliant on the technology that you can just go ahead and start building, because a lot of the things we are building have already been built before. And we're just piecing it together in a way where we're just hyper-focused on customers. If someone is starting today on a new project, is OpenInspect a good fit for them?
I would say yes, with the understanding that you understand the problem that we're trying to solve. The problem becomes present once you start running multiple agents at the same time. If you are not at that kind of level of AI assistedness, I would say no, that it's not a good fit because you're not really going to get the value out of it. Once you move into a team setting where multiple people are contributing on this and there's multiple agents running at the same time, I think is where that value really shines. Similarly, if your team, you have the need for your PMs to be contributing and your environment is non-trivial to set up, I think that can be a pretty big win as well, especially if you're actively hiring, because you have removed that entire setup process for each of those PM. The environment is perfect every time and kind of moved out of the way for them.
So going forward in the larger open source ecosystem, what do you think the upcoming trends, or where is it going to go?
Yeah, I think there's a few trends that are playing out. Background agents as a whole is a big trend. We're seeing Cursor just release their version of it. We're seeing Claude has now added their own kind of automation spin on it. They have Claude Web as well, which is kind of the same idea. Codex under OpenAI, they have their own solution. I think that trend is going to continue. A recent trend that is being talked about is this idea of a world where we are no longer reviewing code. I don't
expand.
The idea being that as AI is generating more code, the volume of that code is going to outpace the ability for humans to review it. I find a lot of the teams that I chat with are already starting to experience a lot of friction with this, where previously they would review maybe 1 to 3 pull requests a day. They're now having to review 10 to 15 pull requests a day or more. And so we're faced with this dilemma where we have this tool that can produce code at a very rapid rate, but we don't necessarily have the human power to actually review through it. And so we eventually have to come up with a solution to this. I see teams doing a lot of different approaches. I have kind of my own ideas around it, but I see that that is kind of the next hurdle to cross in this larger software factory concept.
Software factory concept.
So I had this meme that I created a while back where the idea being that if you're in software engineering, you should pivot to software manufacturing. The idea being that in the previous world, engineers were kind of the equivalent of like artisan widget producers. Your engineer would handcraft this code, they would bring it up for their changes. As agents are doing more of that work, there is a need to standardize that process, very similar to manufacturing, so that we can continue to produce high quality code in a repeatable way. And so if we look at the major components of a factory, we have your production line. I think that background agents is more or less kind of your production line. You are building the infrastructure to produce the widgets. I think the next step is kind of what I just highlighted, which was the quality control, defect management. How do we address this? AI code reviewers are becoming a big thing, and I think will continue. And then lastly, the kind of recall feedback loop aspect of it. Given when a defect does go through, how do we actually correct the system or some mechanism of feedback such that we are driving down defects over time?
So in the concept of being able to push out all these features, one of the things that's happening is people are now spending less time coding. They're spending more time testing. And the testing is now becoming a little bit of a bottleneck. Do you see the code review agents in alleviating that?
Yeah, I think in that software factory analogy, your continuous integration environment is basically your quality control. And so a common setup for most teams is that you're going to run many different checks on every pull request. That could be syntax, could be running your test suites, integration tests. That definitely needs to stay. I don't think we should get rid of that. I see AI code review fitting on top of that. And I think to an extent, it's kind of irresponsible to not have an AI because it excels in catching things that a human might not necessarily catch. As an example, slight variations in library syntax or flags that every engineer on your team is probably not familiar with every flag within some third-party library. The AI is, and it can actually go and look at that library source code and inspect it.
So talking about source code a little bit, you mentioned that before the engineer was the artisan. And there's, I still see a lot of engineers who really pride themselves on that. But now we're getting to a world where if it works, does the code matter anymore?
I think that the engineering is kind of going through an existential crisis around this. I think for a lot of people, it was an identity in a way, writing high quality code. I think that very much still exists. It's, how do you guide high quality agent code? How are you producing high volume and high quality? But I think at the core of engineering, it is really about problem solving. And in my opinion, it was never about writing the code. And unfortunately, if that was what you cared about, that world is going away. And so you should pivot to caring about solving the problem itself and deriving your engagement from that.
Awesome. Cole, to wrap things up, let the people know, what do you have going on in your life and how can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on my personal website. Alternatively, you can find me on LinkedIn. And I would love to help your businesses grow. A lot of my day-to-day splits into two different types of engagements. One is strategy type engagements that we discussed. How do we get a company from wherever they are in this AI journey to state of the art? The other, building the actual AI products. And so whether that is voice agents, whether that's your internal coding agent that hooks into all of these systems, that is a lot of what I focus on within my consultancy. And I would love to help.
Thank you so much. I'm Alex Lee. I run Casca AI, and over the past 2 years, I've had a front row seat to how real people and businesses are adopting and shifting. Every episode, I bring in someone who's in the trenches, founders, engineers, operators, owners, and we have a real conversation about navigating AI's impact in their own profession. This is What's Left.